Hello, I'm John Hind, Director of Compass Resolution Mediation and Coaching. Today, I've got the pleasure and the privilege of talking to Belinda Jones. Belinda is an accredited family mediator, a divorce coach, an accredited divorce coach, a direct child consultant, and parenting coordinator. Belinda is very experienced at helping and supporting couples have some very difficult conversations, which we'll be talking about today, in some very challenging situations, including situations which involve that wide and very complex subject of abuse. So we're going to try and cover kind of four main areas today and talk about that for you, the viewers. And one is really when is mediation and when isn't mediation suitable as a process where there is abuse, and what kind of abuse are we talking about? When we talk about abuse, what are we talking about in abuse? How does a mediator screen and for safety and so on when there is abuse, assessing mediation whether it's suitable or not for these kind of situations, and if mediation does take place, of course, how does the mediator, using the process we've got, mediation, support the couple for the purpose of mediation, which of course is to communicate, make decisions together, and reach agreements outcomes together. And third and fourthly, Belinda will no doubt talk to you a little bit about the area of some mediators having more experience in this knotty area of abuse and specific training in the area of relationship abuse and in terms of mediation. So without more ado, let me welcome Belinda. Good to have you with me today. Good to see you.
Good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No, you're welcome. I look forward to having a chat with you. So let's get on to the first question, Belinda. So can we begin by giving our viewers perhaps a sense of some of the kind of situations and behaviours we're talking about here, which can make mediation a tough process for separating couples when there are allegations of abuse. Bearing in mind, of course, the objective, which I've mentioned already, which is for couples to be able to communicate effectively enough to reach their own decisions and agreements in a safe and fair and balanced way. So what are we talking about here? Just kind of start a broad conversation here in terms of abuse and so on.
Well, I suppose that most people probably already have the recent legislation which specifies that coercive control is a form of abuse, and has moved us on from where we used to be, where we thought domestic abuse was just domestic violence. Obviously, domestic abuse can encompass a number of different forms of abuse. I can read my list to make sure I don't forget all of them, but obviously there's physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, financial, economic, and discriminatory abuse. There's lots of ways in which one person can be abusive towards another, and not all of them are visible in plain sight to a bystander. If we take the sort of examples of coercive control, normally a person has slowly lost their autonomy within a relationship over a period of years, and they probably aren't really aware of the degree to which they're no longer functioning as an autonomous person. And if you bring that set of circumstances into the context of mediation, quite often, I suppose the big risk would be that if a mediator doesn't assess accurately for mediation and goes ahead with mediation, then you can be re-traumatizing that victim, and you can be allowing the perpetrator to use mediation to control it. So that can be in many ways. It could be a clenched jaw. It can just be a tone of voice. There can be many ways in which an abuser can control their victim within any context, but also within the mediation context. If the mediator hasn't spotted that,
using mediation to kind of relive, they're causing the victim to relive the kind of trauma. Like,
absolutely, it certainly can be used by a perpetrator of abuse to try to secure an agreement through the mediation process that wouldn't be allowed in a court process, for example. That's often a sort of a perspective of mediation, that it can be used for that purpose.
I mean, yes, you mentioned autonomy and independence. I think that's so important. I often hear when I'm talking to couples before mediation about the process itself. If I'm hearing that this worry or certainly a narrative from one or both of them, that they feel that their independence, their autonomy, their freedom has been curtailed and controlled by the other person, certainly I'd be going into some depth with them about that discussion. And so when you are screening, when you are assessing, screening, because there's guys out there, you're listening to us at the moment. You've got to remember the purpose of mediation. The purpose of mediation, what we mediators, is to help a couple communicate effectively enough. That doesn't mean suppression, coercion, bullying, all that, effectively enough, so they can make balanced, fair decisions, listening to each other, taking perspectives and all that, and reach outcomes that feel fair to both. Now, of course, that can be challenging at the best of times, problem solving together. So if you add this kind of this dynamic of abuse, it can be even more complicated. So Belinda, how, when we are assessing and screening couples, firstly, let's talk about how you do that and what are you looking for?
Well, the initial assessment at the MIAM assessment meeting is obviously vital. And of course, we speak to both parties before we would make a decision about whether to go ahead with mediation. And
Yes.
assessments really are quite different in both of those sessions. Initially, we are assessing for whether domestic abuse existed either in the past and whether it's ongoing or not. And we can look for other issues such as alcohol, drugs, emotional readiness. Just if somebody is ready to sit in a room with someone and try and have a difficult conversation in the first place. But then, if we suspect that there has been, or if there are allegations of domestic abuse, then with the victim, and of course sometimes a key marker of domestic abuse is quite often the perpetrator is the person who claims to be the victim. So wherever you are in that assessment, you're first of all looking and asking and drilling down with sort of open, sensitive questions, trying to understand how they experience the abuse. You're cross-referencing what they're saying with their body language to sort of understand what the issues are for them, how they felt controlled. And I suppose also how a mediator would spot if they were starting to feel that they were losing their grip on the conversation in a mediation context. As I say, you might find yourself speaking to the person who was actually the perpetrator and they're claiming to be a victim. And if that's the case, obviously every relationship's a dynamic, so you have to explore with each person what is triggered by the other person in themselves, their understanding of themselves, of how they're triggered, their ability to step back and reflect on how their behaviors might affect the other person.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, I'm sure you find the same, is we have an authenticity antenna, because we are in this, we're doing this work a lot, don't we? We're speaking to people every day. And some indicators are, one key word I often find is is a really good thing to explore with in this area is empathy and the lack of. Another one is awareness, self-awareness, or the lack of. Another one is reflection, the ability to reflect on one's own behavior and the impact it's having. How good is someone capable of doing that? I guess we're talking about that. All these indicators, as we're listening to someone's narrative, someone's story. I'm guessing, like you and I will be listening for these clues or indicators of someone's capacity and competence for mediation, but also if we're listening to the narrative, you mentioned this already, if someone's talking about patterns of behavior, they are, so when they're talking about their experience of the other person, which is what obviously we're listening for. So we're speaking to one person, they're telling us about their experience of the other person, and they're talking about patterns of, and again, it's not a question, it's more of a statement here. I'm guessing you're listening for what that person's telling you about that other person's behavior and the impact that behavior is having on the person.
Absolutely, it's the impact on their behavior, and I suppose also where they are in their journey of recovery. If you had two people who've recently separated, there's an escalation in the abusive tactics, and the victim is saying they want to, they want to mediate, but there's been a couple of police call outs. There's, in that sense, the victim might want to mediate, but it probably isn't safe for them to do so. It's in those circumstances, we would probably be referring them out to domestic abuse charities and to legal aid lawyers, and certainly sort of free legal advice if they can't afford it themselves, just to make sure that they have an understanding of the context of their circumstances. And it's the same, I guess, if you're speaking to a perpetrator, if they minimise and they don't accept any of the issues that have been raised, then the likelihood of them being able to be reflected within the mediation context is minimised. It's also, I suppose, you're also looking for the presentation of both people. As I say, it's commonly understood that two people can both feel victims of a particular relationship. And so therefore you do need to drill down to see if one person's angry and aggressive and controlling, but feeling a victim, and the other person is confused, unsure what to do, and really just concerned about the impact on the children, for example, then although both present to you as victims, you have a sense of the dynamic within them both, and you have to probe with them whether they would be able to listen to one another within.
I often think, as I'm listening to someone who, again, do you find this, if the person I'm speaking to, if I'm ascertaining or getting a sense of there is a need to be and feel in control, they have a need to control for various reasons, control in situation, environments, control themselves. If that need is not being met, in other words, the other person who is not allowing them to control because they've now stepped out of the relationship, they've now realized, or they've been through therapy, counseling, they're pushing back on that control, they're asserting their independence, that the controller can often assert that that other person is controlling them because they're not being allowed, empowered to control. The contractual relationship has now broken, the pattern has been broken, and therefore you've got this assertion that the other person is trying to control the controller. Is that what you're talking? Yeah, kind of.
Yes, it is, and I think probably, I suppose, in those circumstances, at MIAM, you're assessing with each person their ability to listen to the person and their view on whether they would be able to take on board information that you maybe refer them to, and within the session, of course, if that's the case, if both parties have, maybe, for example, if their relationship was a number of years in the past and they both move forward, then you might well find that mediation is suitable, because there is some, even if it's a limited capacity, there's some capacity to allow the mediator to slow the conversation down, to reflect on what the other person's saying, and to come up with some sort of a compromise that would, usually in such circumstances, is talking about child arrangements. If there's no safeguarding concern, that social services are not involved, there's no direct risk to the children, then that's usually in everybody's best interest to not re-traumatize people, because of course if they go through the court process, all of the old allegations will come up again, that there'll be a sort of almost a need to justify, stating the same concerns, and as the courts are aware, just as we are, that abuse yesterday is not the same as abuse 10 years ago. It could be, but it might not be. And I think that's part of our MIAM assessment, is to assess with each parent where they are on that journey, and whether they're in a place now, whether they could now mediate. Quite often we hear that people have been told mediation is not suitable because of something that happened many years ago, and it probably wasn't suitable then, but there is, that's part of our assessment, is to assess
people, we're all works in progress. I often use those words when I was listening to you there. I heard one of them as well, this exploration of capacity and competence for mediation. Does each person we're talking to, do we believe and feel that they have the capacity, the resources, the reflection, the ability, the self-regulation, all the rest resources needed for what they're coming into, which is a communication and so on, and also the competence. Do they have the skills? I mean, a certain amount, we'll talk about in a minute. I'm going to talk about how we support them if they do come to mediation, but do they have the basic competence, the basic skill set? I'm thinking of the basic ability and competence to listen. Listen without reacting, to not to try to suppress someone. The capacity, I think it's really key. I think it's a really good point you've raised there. And also this notion, of course, doesn't pick up what you said there. Again, really a really useful point or thing to think about is, if we as mediators say, well, actually, no, we don't think it's suitable, what are we consigning them to? A better process or a worse process? It doesn't mean it's suitable for mediation, but it's worth thinking about actually the impact that court's going to have, and as you say, on the trauma, the thing they're trying to avoid. That's a really.
And often I think that those sort of decisions turn on also just reality checking any sort of safeguarding concerns for children, because obviously in the middle of all of this, you're assessing whether the two people can come together, even if it's online, for example, but come together to have a conversation. But then looking at what each parent is saying that they're proposing, how is that likely to impact on the children? That's always something that that's one of the first things that we would assess right at the beginning of the MIAM, is if there's any safeguarding risk for anybody. Obviously then at that point straight away mediation is not suitable, and court or police or domestic abuse services there where we would refer people to.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of Section 1, Children Act, Children and Young Persons Act, the notion of cruelty and neglect and so on. And again, where, because of course the coercive controlling legislation doesn't apply to children under 16, but then that's all covered by Section, I'm just telling, not, I know you know this, but people out there don't.
Yeah,
Section 1 of the
yeah.
Children and Young Persons Act and so on.
Mm.
So okay, so we mediators have a pretty tough job. We need to be pretty skilled, which is worth remembering, by the way. So when you hear from somebody who's not a mediator or not trained, oh, mediation is not suitable, well, yeah,
That's a mediator can decide that with you. You don't have to go through
exactly.
mediation. You can go to a mediator and they can assess with you whether mediation is suitable. But they also, part of that assessment meeting is to refer you to other people if
Absolutely.
mediation is not suitable, other people who can help.
So let's talk about that actually. So now couple, you're in mediation with Belinda or me. And how can we and the mediation process, the structure of the process, and we as mediators of our skills and so on, how can we, and others out there by the way, how can they support you for the purpose? Remembering the purpose of mediation is to communicate. I'm not talking to you, talking to people out there. The purpose is to talk, make decisions and reach outcomes, whatever they might be, about your children, about the finance and so on. How can we, Belinda, this is now a question for you, how can we, with what we're working, the tools we've got, the process we've got, the skills, the strategy and technique, how can we, it's a big, massive subject, we talk all day about it, but how can we support them? How can we support this couple?
Well, first of all, I suppose the model that you choose is really important. So people might find that they're managing, for example, to make arrangements for their children. There aren't any safeguarding concerns, but there are new conversations that need to be had. If a parent feels that, for example, they would probably freeze in that session if they found that tone of voice, just hearing the other person's voice would still bring them back into a place where they're not really thinking clearly, then we would maybe adopt the shuttle mediation model, and then we would speak to one client, then we go and speak to the other, then we come back. So we'd be relaying information. And each client then has a period on their own while we're relaying to the other client where they can sit and process. So that can slow the process down considerably for people.
Can we do that online?
And we can do that online. I think online is probably the easiest way of doing that now, because of course then people can be sat somewhere comfortable where they are. They don't have to take a day out of their working life, for example. They can be somewhere. We can usually check for whether there's people in the room influencing by sort of panning a camera around, and they are then able to sort of have a conversation in much more slowly reflective way. If we bring people together, then if their relationship, their co-parenting relationship, as it usually is by then, is at a point where they can support that, then normally what we would do is slow the conversation down. We'd name, how important it is to use language carefully to make a difference between causing a reaction from someone and getting a response to what you're saying. We would reframe things, reword things, just so that if for example somebody says something and the other person straight away responds to it or has an answer, we'd slow it down and we just name in a non-confrontational, non-judgmental way what we've heard, and come back. And sometimes, for example, we might spot that there's an agreement where both people feel that they're in disagreement, and that there is sort of that sounds crazy to say, doesn't it? But sometimes we get into habits of communication, and certainly if we're talking about children years after a relationship's ended, we will quickly fall into the negative conversation spiral. So the mediator sometimes just steps in and respectfully and calmly can just reframe what they've heard, and quite often, I suppose, within that, then when both people feel heard and that the communication feels safe, that's often when people go to tears, they can calm and start to.
It's all about, isn't it? It's all about that internal thinking environment. We need to feel calm enough. We need to be thinking. We need them to be thinking. Well, obviously, we need to be thinking as mediators, but we need the couple to be in there, not being triggered ultimately.
Yeah.
So as you say, we need to be modeling good behavior or good language, good communication skills. I often actually, I mean, obviously, I know we use lots of strategies and skills, but I sometimes use. I was mediating this morning with a couple who were being triggered probably every sentence, and it was quite a long 1.5 2 hours. Actually, it's quite exhausting for them and for me actually. What I found would work quite well was, as you said, slowing it down, slowing the pace of my voice down, calming it down, but also asking, when I noticed that there were repeating patterns of triggers, I would say, as you just suggested, I would say, I notice, or I'm observing, when you do this and when you say that, this happens, and I'm noticing this behavior. And then I go, so they go, yes, you get a nod, so they're acknowledging, they think they're feeling heard. then I say to them, what do you want to happen next?
Yeah.
Reflective inquiry, and they go, well, in other words, rather than tell them, rather than say to them, it's not working for you, they often say, oh, you're absolutely right. So what would you like to happen next? And the next question I say, well, how would you like me to support you doing that? And then we go back to because then goes boom, and then back to what they were trying to discuss in the first place.
I think if you find people who are reflective in some way and they've moved some way on from where they were,
you can do that. Yeah,
you can ask each parent what they want from the other parent in order to for communication to work. And I suppose the thing that we don't know until we experience it is we don't have to go back and relive that relationship to have effective communication about children. We can agree to disagree about many things and to only talk positively and respectfully about issues relating to the children. And that is, I think that's empowering for a lot of people when they're at the right stage of their their journey.
Keeping them focused on things that are very common needs, like they want the welfare of their children, they want the children to thrive. Most parents would say that, of course. And also this, as you said, this distinction between the separation story or the divorce story, which has gone on, and the business of divorce, the need to parent their kids, the need to sort out finance. So it is the distinction between the divorce story and the business of divorce. It's kind of it's almost superhuman. Some people find it a superhuman task to do that, keep that separation. But that's what we're trying to do out there. By the way, we're in mediation with you out there, and you get stuck. That's what we're trying to do all the time, trying to keep it a boundaried and keep you focused and in the present, in the future, in the focus, and so on. And we just ask that you will do your best.
Indeed.
Other experts. I mean, what about other experts using other experts to support this?
Yes, I was going to say yes. I think so. I think if you've got somebody who is somewhere along their journey, they understand, they have the reflectiveness to understand the situation that they were in, but maybe they're not 10 years down the line, they're only a few years down the line. I think quite often it can be helpful to bring in some sort of somebody that they may be working with as a therapist, or if we refer them to a domestic abuse charity, quite often they will signpost the client to somewhere else, and they can always either use their therapist as a background support, or they can, with the agreement of the other person, bring them into a mediation session. And I suppose it's also important to note that I think we're often mainly talking about child arrangements in post-relationship communication, but of course if you have two people who are still trying to navigate their finances, then and there's been domestic abuse in the background, that can also be really helpful. I think what we find then is that people don't want to go through court. They don't want to be sitting in a courtroom with someone, whether there's a screen or not. And quite often, I suppose what we're aware of is sometimes the victim just wants to get out with a way of life moving forward. They don't want to fight for every last penny, and so they will often find the least best, the financial sort of agreement, just so that they can move on and they can walk away from the conflict. And I think within mediation, if that's what somebody wants, if that's where somebody's minded to be, we can support them to not have to have that direct conflict. Obviously, they would still have their lawyers with them, so they would be taking legal advice along the way, either again coming into the process with us, or at least even having them at the end of a phone call. We can break out and take time out for people to rely on support services. So I think that's the benefit of mediation, is that there is somebody there holding the whole process, but who understands what a client's going through, both practically and emotionally and psychologically.
So notion, I'm visualizing a notion of a mediation team, a team of experts. It could be just the mediator and the two decision makers.
Yeah.
But if someone else is required, it's a team to support the particular needs of this couple, whether it's financial, psychological, emotional, but it's centered around the core purpose of mediation, which is to help and support them to make their own decisions and reach their own outcomes. That's what we're talking about. And I guess if we look at those terms, it can actually take many different forms. It can be someone who's quite integrated and supporting the couple. It can involve, as you say, counselors, divorce coaches, therapists, financial experts, earning capacity, employment, pension, and so on. And actually, the person who's at the centre of this is the facilitator.
Drawing people in, and I suppose assessing with each client where the needs lie. And so, as the sort of psychological and emotional needs are obviously as important often as any of the other needs. But yes, they
Yeah. I thought it's pretty core, actually, isn't it? Because we're still talking about this notion of abuse or very difficult behaviours, which can be abusive.
Well, obviously, financial abuse is one of the many abuses. So, if it is exiting an abusive relationship, it might well be that they have somebody who is trying to control the finances, is trying to agree something that would be would be on the right on the edge of what a judge would order, or beyond that. And so that is still something that presents in mediation, and that we can work with, but we would work with each client and work out who the professionals are who they would benefit from using as support.
So I don't know where you are at the time, but we're probably coming towards the end. So I really want to move. I mean, each of these areas are massive, quite large. But I want to move to something like the final area, really, which is it's worth people out there who have a very difficult relationship are considering mediation, that there are some mediators who are maybe more experienced than others, or better trained. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Certainly, yeah. All mediators are trained in domestic abuse. That's part of our background training, and our ongoing training would obviously we're updating ourselves all the time, and the world of psychology is coming into the workplace more and more anyway. So through our supervision, we would be discussing these issues on an ongoing basis. However, I think some mediators take more of an interest in it, probably do more training, and are more prepared to and experienced and knowledgeable to enough to work with more difficult cases than others. So I suppose that is always something to bear in mind, as some mediators might feel it's not within their skill set. Yeah, absolutely. So what one mediator might say this isn't suitable, another would. So I suppose in a way, if you feel that you're exiting a difficult relationship, or you have exited in the past and you still have ongoing conversations, it's probably worth speaking to a number of mediators just to see who you feel comfortable working with, because different mediators bring very different skill sets.
Yes, yes, indeed. I was just thinking, as you were talking, I was also thinking how often I'm more frequently now, probably 1 in 5 of the couple, or both of the couples say, or usually one of them actually, do you have experience in recognizing and awareness and working with narcissists or controlling behaviors or whatever? They want to know that, and what they're asking is, can you support me to have a conversation with it? I mean, I always then delve down in why you asking, what's going on there, and so on. But actually, that's a really important point, actually, that rather like doctors, accountants, any professionals, actually, we all have our specialisms, and and it's worth having that conversation with the mediator. So in the MIAM, the mediation information and assessment meeting that a client will have, is often 45 minutes to an hour. It could be quite a good hour conversation. You out there, clients, you need to feel that if you feel that the mediator you've spoken to is the right person, go with them. But if you feel that you're not sure, then you have a conversation with them, because you don't have to. It's really important you get the right person. Trust and confidence is important. Yeah,
absolutely.
So if they want to find you, I know you're on the Compass Resolution. You're one of our team. One of our team of coach. So actually, Belinda is a divorce coach. She's on our divorce coaching team. She's also a family mediator on our family mediation team as well, and parenting coordinators. Lots of skill sets that Belinda has. So you can obviously find her on the Compass Resolution site. She's also contributed to the divorce manual, which we're not talking about today. But so where else can they find you? Because you've got your own business, very thriving business as well. So
that's Cambridge Family Matters, and you could find me on www.cambridgefamilymatters.com.
Yeah, and you do a lot worse than to work with and find Belinda when you're out there within these very tricky situations. Anything else you think it's worth? Just as we bring this to an end, you think we haven't talked about that the couple out there might want to hear about or know about? Anything that you think is worth raising at this stage before we kind of close down?
I think really just that it's always worth coming to a MIAM. The MIAM doesn't mean the assessment meeting. It doesn't mean that you have to go ahead with mediation. At least you can discuss your circumstances, and you can get some sort of a sense of where you sit within the different services that are on offer to anybody who's separating, and from at that point you might find that the mediator can signpost you elsewhere if in fact domestic abuse is a reason to not mediate at that time. But I suppose I would always say bear in mind that it's not a one-time decision. Sometimes it's not. People are struggling when they first separate, isolated, and I think the risks are higher at that point, because quite often the shift can mean that if somebody's exiting an abusive relationship, the level of abuse can increase, but that level of abuse, it doesn't necessarily sit there forever. So I think it's just always worth bearing in mind that there's a time and a place for most people with, with mediation. It might not be now, but it's something that you might find that you benefit from further down the line.
Keeping one's mind open to possibilities, including timeframes. It may not be right now, but it might be right in 6 months. And if so, what do you need to be thinking about now, the next 6 months, to be putting in place? So our job as mediators is to help people. So thank you very much for that. It's a really good point about the Maya, because it's really topical at the moment. And I think if every single separating couple out there first came to an information and assessment meeting with a mediator to talk about mediation and another process, what you'd get, clients, is you'd get information, legal information, early information, you'd get guidance, you'd get the mediator talk to you about pathways, your options, your process options. You would get referrals, references to information, to resources, support an awful lot. And pretty much every single client, and I'm sure you may, on an ending note, every single client pretty much I see now who've been through a mediation information meeting say, gosh, I didn't know that, or I learned a lot there. I feel clearer about my options and so on now, and whether or not they go to mediate or not. Thank you very much, Belinda. I didn't want to finish because you're the person here, you're the key person here, so I didn't want to really finish on that note. But thank you very much for your time. That's been really, really interesting. If anyone out there has been listening to us and it has triggered some, I don't know, possibility thinking, is mediation possible? Contact us, contact Belinda, contact me. I may well put you in contact with Belinda. I may have a chat with you myself. Doesn't matter. But speak to a mediator and then just find out really whether it is suitable in your situation where you feel that there is a really difficult abusive relationship. So thank you again, Belinda. We're going to bring it to an end here, and I'll see you again, no doubt, very soon. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.